Very good. So happy to be here. And yes, it is. I was excited this morning to have the opportunity to speak to my colleagues from what I consider to be my home state of Oregon. My parents moved us to Eugene, and when my sisters and I were very little. So I went through from grade school through graduate school in Eugene, Oregon. They very thoughtfully picked a lovely place to raise a family, and for a very long time, there was no reason for me to leave. So I have deep roots in Oregon, definitely a big fan of the Ducks. Fun to watch them doing so well in football. But today, we're going to talk about another favorite topic of mine, which is reading, and particularly reading fluency. This became an interest of mine way back when I was a reading specialist and had learned a lot of really good information. I was very lucky to have studied at the University of Oregon and learned some things that we would now referred to clearly as the science of reading. Back then, it was just best practices from direct instruction and those ideas. So I felt very well prepared to go into my job as a reading specialist. But I did find that along the way that some of my students, although they could read the words well, sometimes that wasn't enough to help them understand the words. And often they struggled with reading well. I didn't really even have the vocabulary to talk about what was going on, but additional studies really connected me. And of course, when the National Reading Panel came out and helped us understand some of the big components of reading, I did understand that much of what I was thinking about, talking about, and struggling with my students was reading fluency. And today I'm going to talk about reading fluency as the most current understandings of what this aspect of reading is, and some ideas around assessing and teaching reading fluency. I have about 75 minutes with you, which is a limited amount of time to talk about this aspect of reading. And so I'm just going to let you know that these ideas are pulled from a book I had the pleasure of writing with my good friend and colleague, Deb Glazer, she's well known for her work with the letters training materials, as well as her own online training program called the Top 10 Tools for Reading Teachers. But she and I collaborated on a book about reading fluency, Understand, Assess, and Teach. So some of the ideas here are pulled from this book. If you want a chance to dig a little deeper, this book is one source for you. For our time today, I'm going to talk about a lot of different things, but the key takeaway I want you to connect with is that fluency, we're going to spend all this time talking about fluency, but I really want you to understand even more deeply, because I assume you do understand this already. This is not new news to anybody, but that fluency is really only important when we consider it as a support for comprehension and motivated reading. Comprehension, we always talk about comprehension, we're talking about reading. I sometimes think we don't talk enough about motivated reading, which is so important, because if we can't inspire children to want to read, they're not going to do enough reading to become skillful reading. So fluency by itself, like many of the other components we talk about, phoneme awareness or phonics, really the value of this is all about its support to comprehension. So that means that all aspects of fluency should be connected to comprehension. When we're assessing fluency, when we're instructing fluency, we need to understand why we're doing it. What's the purpose? And the purpose always is comprehension and motivation. So that's the key takeaway idea. My goal for this session, I borrowed this from my friend and colleague, Anita Archer. I was watching yet another one of her wonderful online webinars. I've been working with and learning from Anita for many decades, but at a recent webinar, she said that her goal for the webinar was to affirm the knowledge that people came in with and say, you're correct in what you understand, remind people of some things they might not have thought about before, and possibly expand your knowledge, add to the information you have. I think it was a wonderful way to express a goal for doing a webinar with professional colleagues like yourself. So I've divided this session into 3 parts, starting with defining reading fluency, some time talking about assessing reading fluency, and then some time on teaching reading fluency. After each of these sessions, I will pause for some reflection and questions before I go on to the next session. So any thoughts you have or reactions or questions or concerns, you put those in the chat, and then after each section, I'll attempt to answer at least some of them. So let's start with the defining reading fluency. And this comes from the book that Deb and I wrote, the acknowledgement that fluency is one part of reading, and reading is a highly complex task that involves many interconnected and codependent linguistic processes, each of which draw upon a variety of separate skills. This thing we call reading is very, very complex, and there are many ways to represent this complexity. I am, like I'm sure many of you are, I'm a big fan of Scarborough's Rope, this lovely now 20-year-old infographic that so accurately represents at least some of the complexity of learning to read. So like the developers of the model, The Simple View of Reading, she's taking this incredibly complex human activity and breaking it into 2 larger blocks, and then deconstructs them a little bit. So acknowledging that in order to be a reader, you must have language comprehension, which she defines in those component pieces. And a reader must be able to recognize, decode, understand, I guess is the top, but just be able to recognize those words, turn that whatever representation that we are using, print or a tactile representation of Braille or whatever representation we're using, connect that with the language that we have in our head to make meaning. And I'm also very appreciative of her showing the representation of skilled reading, which she labels. This is the target. It's the target of our conversation here today, but this labeling of skilled reading as the fluent execution and coordination of those 2 component pieces, the word recognition and the text comprehension. So that tightly woven rope at the end of Scarborough's Rope is really what we should think about as reading fluency. I heard a webinar. I do a lot of listening to webinars, as I'm sure some of you do too, try to fit that into your busy professional schedule. But I was listening to a webinar that Dr. Scarborough did, talking about her rope and how it came to be. And she was asked what changes she would make. And she said the most frequent change that people suggest that she make is to put fluency in there. She has the language comprehension, the word recognition, different components, but fluency by name is not represented except in this definition here. And she said she felt that it was sufficiently represented because it is the outcome of all these component pieces being executed and coordinated to a level of automaticity. So I agree with her. I would not want fluency added in any other way. I think it's well represented there. One of the things that we need to remember, and some work I've done recently with Marianne Wolf helped me remember that she and her colleagues have reminded us that we often, when we're talking about fluency, we're really talking about passage fluency or text fluency. But all of that depends upon fluency in the component pieces that starts really much, much earlier. So she and her colleague Katzer-Cohen remind us that fluency develops in progressions. We all acquire every skill, whether we're playing the piano, learning to play golf, learning to play board games, whatever it is. We start with just learning the component pieces so that we can do it accurately. We can put our fingers on the right keys accurately. We can hold the tennis racket accurately. And then with that accuracy, we build on that to achieve automaticity. We never sacrifice accuracy. We build on the accuracy to do it at a rate that's appropriate for the task at a level of automaticity. And for reading, we start at the letter level, the letter sound level, the letter pattern level, the word level, and then when words are put into phrases or sentences or larger units of language, then the semantic and syntactic processes come in. So it's a very important reminder to us that this thing we're often thinking about for fluency, text fluency, starts way, way back at the letter and sound level. When we are talking about passage fluency, and again, this comes from the book that Deb and I wrote, we talk about fluency as being reasonably accurate reading at an appropriate rate with suitable expression. And many definitions of fluency, if you've read papers or textbooks or chapters or webinars about fluency, you'll see these three components often or always included. We went on to add comprehension and motivation to our definition because, again, fluency by itself, I'm sure Hollis Scarborough would agree and others, is that there's really no value in discussing fluency unless you connect it to comprehension and motivation. And what we say is it doesn't guarantee comprehension, certainly it doesn't guarantee motivation, but if you're fluent, it can lead to accurate and deep comprehension and motivation. So those are the component pieces, but then we went ahead and also used these more fluid, I guess you will, less precise adjectives to describe each of these things. So when we're talking about accuracy, we want it to be reasonable. We want the rate to be appropriate. We want the expression to be suitable. So let me further define what we mean by that. When we're talking about reasonably accurate, it's extremely important that we get this right in our understanding and our teaching of fluency. So we're going to emphasize this with a bunch of F words here, all of these component pieces, but nothing to be concerned about. The first F that we're going to use is the word first, because this is what Wolf and Katz-Cohen are reminding us, that accuracy comes first in fluency. It must come first, and that's why we put it first in our definition, unlike the National Reading Panel, which put rate first in their definition. We list it first because that's what has to come first if we're ever going to achieve reasonable levels of accuracy. First, foremost, again, think about the value of fluency is comprehension. So we need to have a certain level of accuracy in place in order for comprehension to happen. So it's of all the aspects of fluency, it is of foremost importance. And the third F is forever. So it's not just what we should be concerned about in kindergarten and first grade. Accuracy is of foremost importance throughout our reading. And it is first, foremost, and forever important because it serves as the foundation of fluency. So when we are thinking about the importance of accuracy, we want to think about these 5 F's. But what about reasonable accuracy? And we're really thinking about levels of accuracy in independent reading. And I want to make that case because when I'm sitting in front of a student, maybe a kindergartner just learning the component pieces of reading, or a second grader who has learned how to decode, but now needs to move to that level of automaticity. When I have the privilege and honor and responsibility of working with a child or a group of children or a class of children, accuracy, I'm going to strive for 100%. This is the opportunity to work with a teacher. They make a mistake on a word using whatever would be the most appropriate correction procedures, because it would vary whether I'm working with one individual child or a whole classroom of students. But I want to be sure that we have the opportunity to be fully accurate and have all errors corrected when they're reading on their own, or when they're reading with me. But when they're reading independently, we do have some guidance from research that suggests that in order to be reasonably accurate in our comprehension, we have to be at least 95% accurate in our reading of words. We can only make about 5% errors before comprehension is impeded. And that is really kind of tough to wrap your head around. I think when I first saw that, I thought that's really too high. But there's research as well as some activities that we can do. If you take a piece of text and cover up 5% of the words, you're going to be having a hard time comprehending it. It really does need to be that high. When we talk about our emerging readers, those students who are just beginning to figure out how to decode, they're just beginning to orthographically map words into their brains to become sight words. What is the percentage that researchers say needs to be in place when they're reading independently again? And the guidance from research is actually a little bit higher than for established readers, 97 to 98%. It's not that comprehension works differently for these readers. It's really that we need to be sure that we're providing text to them that they can read with high levels of accuracy. This aligns very closely with the Common Core standards and others that suggest, based on good scientific evidence, that the challenging readers that we want our students to be able to, the challenging reading that we want them to do, that complex text and challenging text, really should not be part of learning, the early stages of learning to read. That should really not come in until late second grade, early third grade, even for our on-track readers. So it's very important that we work to those levels of accuracy. When we're talking about rate, if I believed what I saw in a lot of classrooms, I would have to believe that the appropriate rate must be absolutely as fast as possible. We actually know that is not true. And I love this quote from Steve Stahl and Melanie Kuhn, who said back in 2002 that fluent reading should sound like speech. That made so much sense even back in 2002. But now, almost 20 years later, we understand much more about why that's so important. It has to do with comprehension, the increasing understanding that what we're asking our human brains to do is to read and understand print representations of spoken language is a really, really difficult task. Our brains have not yet evolved to make sense of print without a whole lot of scaffolding and work, and the brain needs to physically reorganize itself. Just reading is an incredibly difficult task. We do know that we luckily have had many, many eons of evolutionary support for understanding language. The reason we're all here is because somewhere way, way, way back in our past, our ancestors figured out how to communicate with each other. And that communication way, way, way back was based on language, some kind of evolving language. But we do have brains that support speech and understanding speech. So when we can make our reading mirror speech as much as possible, that is a huge jumpstart for helping comprehend what we read. So the more that reading can sound like and mirror speech, not in all aspects, it helps with comprehension. But we can get a little bit more precise about this. It's not just make it sound like speech and we're done talking about rate. We have a way of being more precise in terms of how fast should a student read? What number of words should they be able to read correctly per minute? And we often measure that using a process called oral reading fluency. I'm sure you're all very familiar with that. Different versions of it exist, but we have students read a passage of text that has been unpracticed, 60 seconds. Usually for most decisions we make, it's grade level text. And when they are finished with that, we have a score of words correct per minute. And then we can compare that score to some norms that have been established. And if you're using one of the number of commercially available oral reading fluency measures, you may be using the norms that come with that measure. My colleague at the University of Oregon, Jerry Tyndall, and I, over a period of, now about 25 years, have done studies where we took the words correct per minute oral reading fluency score of large numbers of children across different grades, and then created percentiles to show the different rates that students were reading. Our first study was done back in 1992 with a very small number of scores from students in second grade through fifth grade. Really back in the late 80s, early 90s, not that many people were using the ORF measure, so we didn't have access to very many scores. By 2006, our second study, we had access to about a quarter of a million students, and this went from the middle of first grade through eighth grade on that study. And our most recent study, published in 2017, and it's published as a research report on the website listed below, the BRT, Behavioral Research and Teaching Projects at the University of Oregon. For this study, we had access to 6 million scores, this time from the middle of first grade through sixth grade. And this was one of the handouts for today. It's also available at that BRT website. So when you look at this, you can see kids are reading all different kinds of scores. So those numbers you're seeing are words correct per minute, organized by percentiles, but okay, that doesn't tell us exactly what is the appropriate rate. So based on research done by other people, we would say that what we should be aiming for from across all those grade levels would be the range of the 50th to the 75th percentile across all of those grade levels. And the reason we say that is because in the research that people have done about optimal rate, there just is not evidence, it's very, very limited, that would suggest that there's any benefit to comprehension or motivation above that 75th percentile. So that range is really important, and the evidence is really interesting. I'll show you a little bit of evidence here in a second. But we also know, all of you who are practitioners know, that when children get in the habit of reading as fast as they can, it can be detrimental. It moves outside of the range of spoken language, overwhelms the brain. If we read too fast, we simply can't understand it. So one of the studies that we use to suggest that range of the 50th to 75th percentile is This is a very recent study done in 2021, looking back at the 2018 NAEP data, and went and took some of those kids from fourth grade that scored at different levels on the NAEP, which is essentially an assessment of reading comprehension, and then assessed some of these students for their words correct per minute score, and found very interestingly, well, let me first, interestingly, that the advanced students who scored advanced on the NAEP test scored at about 160 words correct per minute. If they were proficient, they were reading about 142 words correct per minute. And barely at a basic level at 123. And if they fell below basic, those words correct per minute were significantly lower. And those line up very closely with the end of the year Hasbrouck and Tyndall norms for fourth grade. I mean, exactly 160 is the top. So again, it's not going to get you more comprehension, and we can be reading too fast for comprehension to happen. But you can see that the 50th percentile is really important. If we 133, if you can't get there, you can't even really get much past the basic level of reading. So that's some of the evidence we use for that suggestion. But we do have significant evidence that it is really crucial to help our students get close to or at the 50th percentile. And again, this is on grade level text without practice or support. So the general idea about this is that research suggests that the 75th percentile is sufficient for optimizing comprehension. The 50th percentile is necessary for comprehension. So if we turn our attention to the third component, expression, we can go back to Stahl and Kuhn saying it should sound like speech. The more we can help our students mirror spoken language, it facilitates comprehension. The newest thinking around expression is certainly there are aspects of comprehension, of expression, excuse me, that contribute to comprehension. Things like teaching students the importance of stopping at periods and pausing at commas and those kinds of things. But more recent research is suggesting that expression is generally an outcome of the good expression is an outcome of comprehension rather than contributing. And if you think about reading text that is well beyond your comprehension level, and a good example, I think, is if any of you are learning a second or third language, and you attempt to read in that language, and you're not really proficient in understanding the language, but you can figure out what the words are. Are you really able to use the expression that the author is trying to embed in that if you don't understand what the words are? Should you be excited? Should you be terrified? Should you just be neutral and bland? If you don't understand what those words mean, you really can't choose the appropriate expression to use. So expression is valuable, but of the components of fluency, accuracy and rate play a much greater role in that outcome of comprehension and motivation. So we consider those the components of fluency, but in the book, Deb and I talk about the mechanics of fluency, all of these things that have to be going on in the background in order to achieve that tightly woven rope that Scarborough has on her infographic. So just an acknowledgement that fluency is complex. We have all these component pieces that must be learned at the accuracy level, practiced to a level of automaticity or appropriate rate, and then through that practice where our students do that work, we hope that they arrive at this end goal of the tightly woven rope, that fluent execution of those component pieces. So when we think about the purpose of reading, again, just to underscore the message here, we know that accuracy is important, that component, first, foremost, and forever, because comprehension is going to be limited by inaccurate reading, and it doesn't have to be very inaccurate before it is limited. Rate is important too, because comprehension is limited by reading that is either too inefficient, slow, and laborious, or too fast. There is that optimal rate that facilitates comprehension because it mirrors language. And then all of you practitioners know, if you've worked with struggling readers, you've experienced this very sad, self-perpetuating formula here that lack of fluency leads to lack of motivation. It just, students who struggle with fluency are not your motivated readers. And if they're not motivated, they're going to read less. If they read less, that has an impact on their vocabulary. And that also then contributes to a limited or reduced comprehension. And then that becomes self-perpetuating. They fall further behind. They don't understand what they read. Reading is hard. It's unmotivated. They read even less. So we can summarize all this, the role of reading fluency: comprehension, and a touch of motivation as well. So as promised, I said that I would stop momentarily and take some questions, and I see that there are some in the chat, so maybe I can take a look over there.
Yes, we have a couple of beautiful questions, so I can pose them for you.
That'd be
So
lovely.
Sarah's question is, I've read some of Christopher Such's work, and he says that we need to read at 90 words per minute to gain comprehension of text. What are your thoughts on this?
I think that I'd have to know a little bit more about what population he's talking about, because first graders, we do not expect first graders to read 90 words correct per minute, and first graders can understand the text that they've read. So he may be talking about older adult readers, that is the absolute minimum threshold of reading. I think that the way Jerry Tyndall and I talk about rate in terms of words correct per minute and align that with different stages of development at different times of year, that makes more sense to me, because I know that our looking at now literally millions of students, that first graders, the expectation is reading somewhere around 60 words correct per minute, 60 to 75 or so words correct per minute by the end of first grade. And we expect those students to comprehend their text. And the text they're reading is not very complex, but we want them, if they've read the house is big, or the dog is red, or mom is strong, that they understand what those words are. So I would have to look more at that actual, why he drew those conclusions. Anything else?
Oh, and Sarah responded in the chat that he cites McGinnis's work.
Okay.
So I don't know if that helps you.
Well, yeah, I hold McGinnis high in the comprehension research, but again, I would have to put that in some kind of context, because it's not true for beginning readers. They can understand very basic, simple text, reading at a reasonable level. So I'll look more into that. That's helpful for me. I'll explore that. Thanks.
Perfect. Thanks for answering that. We have another question from Jennifer. Is it best to use commercially available oral reading fluency passages, or is any grade level passage acceptable? I know Read Naturally made their own and offers 30. Are these just as good versus others? So for example, Dibbles, Ames Web, or Easy CBM? Yeah.
That's a really good question. And there is a group of people who have rated the various oral reading fluency, the commercially available assessments, including the level of, or the value of their passages. The National Center on progress monitoring, I think it's the National Center for Progress Monitoring have done some ratings, and they do vary. I really am a fan of the passages from the Read Naturally progress monitoring assessment. Some people use the Read Naturally passages that are part of their instructional program for using for progress monitoring, and that they are not meant for that, but they created some specific passages for progress monitoring. I really like those, in part because I think they really work to make those as consistent as possible. I find that some of the other passages have a lot of variance in them, and when the passages vary in difficulty, you're going to have scores go way up or way down based not on the student's skill, but on the passage difficulty and the variance of the passage. So I think whatever you use, understand that students are going to respond differently to different passages. So that's one of the reasons we always say, make sure that you're giving sufficient number of progress monitoring or collecting a sufficient number before you make a decision about whether things are going in the right direction or not, because you will have spikes and you will have valleys. But if you're using a set of materials and you find a whole lot of students are having difficulty with one, their scores are all going down, or conversely, all the students are really adding 15 words to their score, maybe you don't want to use that one next year or with other students. It's perfectly okay for you to make some of those professional decisions about the quality for your students.
Great, thank you. So we have another question in the chat. So this is from Joyce. Can you share one or two strategies a teacher can do with one-on-one without technology with the student to improve accuracy?
Well, even that question's a wonderful, wonderful and highly important question. We need to know what type of error was made on the word. First, the age of the student that we're dealing with, because if we're dealing with a 7th grader, the kinds of errors that they may be making are very different from a 2nd grader, we would assume. So we have to look at what type of word are they having trouble with. If it's an occasional word here or there, that's a whole different thing. If it's a pattern, they can read and decode fairly accurately simple words, CCVC, or some kind of pattern, but when they get to certain types of blends or morphographic endings or multiple syllable words, we do the intervention around that. So look for the error types, devote some time on really getting the students' attention to practicing, bring up their level of accuracy. It's so critically important. So it depends on the word type, but practice and really, really adhering to what the evidence is coming around these days on speech to print activities, making sure that they know what that word is or the function of that word, that it's a familiar word to them, and then having them see the word, say the word, hear the word, write the word. That multiple modality aspect about reading at the word level can make a big difference too. So maybe one more question if there is one, Nicole, otherwise we'll go on. Don't want to get too far behind.
Those are all that were submitted for this section.
Excellent.
So we're perfect.
Timing. We will move on to assessing fluency. And so we talked about those 3 components of fluency, and for assessing, I really want to turn my attention to that accuracy and rate, because those are the easiest to measure. They're also, we have the best tools for those. We can measure them with a certain level of objectivity, and the evidence is really clear that those are the major components to what we consider to be fluent reading. So we can go back to what we've been talking about, that oral reading fluency assessment of those unpracticed. It sounds like from the questions, at least some of you are very familiar with them. For benchmark screening, we use grade level text for those assessments. And there are many now commonly used commercial versions, and some of those have already been mentioned in the question. The Dibbles 8, Acadians, AimsWeb, EasyCBM, FAST, iStation has iSIP, and there are others. But across all of these, and they all come from the same research base of curriculum-based measurements. So they all basically are the same assessment with different passages and slightly different bells and whistles in how they interpret the scores. But they're all essentially the same assessment, an oral reading fluency assessment. And I wanted to spend some time in this session to talk about 4 of the most common confusions I hear about ORF, even among researchers and teacher educators, and many who have heard about ORF, they may have used ORF, but there are very common confusions. So this is one of those places where this may confirm what you've already learned or may deepen your understanding a little bit more. So the most common confusion I hear expressed, and this is the one I hear from researchers a lot who haven't thoroughly thought about this, that the measure that was labeled oral reading fluency, or sometimes we refer to it as ORF, that measure measures fluency. And I always very sarcastically say, why would anybody think that a measure called oral reading fluency would measure fluency? And I say that sarcastically because it doesn't measure fluency. It was not meant to measure reading fluency. There's great acknowledgement from the people who study curriculum-based measurement, who study these assessments. There's a wide agreement, universal agreement really, that the ORF assessment was misnamed. Some of these experts, Michelle Hosp and colleagues, wrote this wonderful book, The ABCs of CBM, now in its 2nd edition. And when they talk about the ORF assessment, which they spend quite a bit of time talking about it because they value it highly, they talk about the research, it's just such a good, useful tool, but they say it should never have been called ORF. They suggest instead that we use the term to label the assessment. Remember, we're just talking about the assessment as perhaps oral passage reading, or OPR. Interestingly, if you go back and look at the original CBM research, the original name for the measure was RAFT, reading aloud from text for 60 seconds. That was the name of the assessment, but somewhere along the line, it got named oral reading fluency. And then it gets confused, and people then, as we'll talk about a little bit, say we shouldn't be using fluency as a measure of comprehension. And we'll talk about that in a minute. But what we should understand, fluency, oral reading fluency, ORF, RAFT, oral passage reading, is a measure of accuracy and rate. And those are 2 essential components, as we've seen, for comprehension. So it's a very important thing to measure. What it really is as a construct is automaticity. And automaticity, if you can't do something at a level of automaticity, you're not going to be very good at it. If you can play the piano, but you play at the basic level without that fluidity and fluency, it's not going to sound very good. And the same with every other skill, including reading. We have to reach a level of automaticity. For reading, it's because of comprehension. What we do know, and Deb and I talk about this in our book, if you're really going to measure, to assess or diagnose that complex construct, think about Scarborough's rope. All those component pieces have to be woven together. You have to do more than a 60-second measure. And then you have to be sure you're assessing all 3 components, not just the accuracy and rate, but also include the expression or prosody and those underlying mechanics of fluency as necessary. So no, oral reading fluency does not measure fluency. The second most common confusion I hear is that we always want the highest words correct per minute score as possible. Higher is better. And we've kind of addressed this a little bit, but yeah, the answer is no. And that goes back to what Stahl and Kuhn said about it has to mirror speech for our brain to make sense of it. And what I shared with you before is that the research doesn't show value to students being above the 75th percentile, but we do know that there's a concern about being too slow, that those students who are not at the 50th percentile really cannot achieve even basic levels of comprehension. But faster and faster and faster is not correct. And I do understand how this confusion came about, because in almost every other human endeavor, we do want to be higher, faster, richer, smarter, in so many things. But there's one area where we really want to be average, where average is perfect. And that is pretty much anything that has to do with bodily functions. We want our blood pressure to be average, not high, not low, just average. We want our body temperature to be average. That's perfect. Higher, a fever, no. Low body temperature, you can die if it gets too low. We want to be average. And automaticity, or accuracy and rate, we want it to be average because of the way our brains work. Our human brains process information. It's a bodily organ. Our brain can process information when it comes in at the average rate of speech and comprehension. There's a range around there for sure, but faster is not better. Common confusion number 3. Hear this a lot. Very understandable when people say, come on, we're spending all this time listening to kids read with our stopwatches. We really should be assessing comprehension. And what I say to this is, yeah, sure, of course. Comprehension is the most important thing. But the problem is comprehension is very, very complex. If we think about Scarborough's rope as being complex, when we start to even wrap our heads around what comprehension is, it's made up of so many different component pieces. So it's very difficult to measure. It can be measured. If any of you here are school psychologists or special educators, or those who are charged with doing the diagnosis or identification of students as having a learning disability, you're very aware that there are tools that have been developed that have very trusted reliability and validity for measuring many aspects of reading, including comprehension, but they take a long time. Way more than 60 seconds. When we're measuring using one of those validated measures of reading comprehension, it's often around a 2-hour test, or even longer in some cases. So yeah, it can be measured, but it takes a lot of time. And so we've turned for the past 3 or more decades to this ORF measure, this words correct per minute measures, because we have decades now of research that show that they have a moderate to strong correlation with reading comprehension. They serve as a good indicator of this thing that we care so much about, comprehension. So we have over 30 years of studies, but I like showing this one because this one study to show that connection between words correct per minute and comprehension, because it was so elegantly designed. It very clearly shows this connection. So in this study, the researchers took a group of 5th graders, and what their research question was to say, how can we most efficiently and correctly determine what these students' reading comprehension is? So the first thing they did was have expert assessors give one of those 2-hour tests to each of the kids and found out what we would consider their true reading comprehension. Whatever score that was, they put it aside. And then they went ahead and administered these other assessments and took those scores and then correlated them. See how closely related to the true comprehension do these other scores come? How well do they predict comprehension? And they do that through a process of called correlations to establish a validity coefficient. So all these fifth graders did a retell. They read a passage and then at an oral recall or retell measure. That was scored and then compared to their true comprehension assessment. And in this case, the correlation was 0.70 in this study. And those of you who are familiar with correlation coefficients, a 0.70 is a strong, at least a moderately strong correlation to, in this case, their reading comprehension. And I don't think anybody would disagree that the ability to read a piece of text and accurately retell what was in that text is at least an indicator of comprehension. They also administered a cloze test where the students take a passage and words are omitted from the passage and they literally guess what word went in that passage. When that was scored and correlated with their comprehension in this study, it correlated almost identically to a retell. Then they had the students read a passage and answer some multiple choice questions. That correlated with their true comprehension very strongly at 0.82. Very, very strong correlation. And that's one of the reasons that answering comprehension questions, multiple choice questions is often used to assess knowledge or comprehension because it's very efficient. We can give it to thousands of people all at the same time. It can be scored objectively, and it does have a strong correlation to what students really know or their ability to comprehend. And I often joke that at this point they said, hey, you know what, we've got 60 seconds left over. Let's do a words correct per minute assessment. I know that it was more thoughtful than that, but they did do that. They had each of these fifth grade students read a fifth grade passage unpracticed, correlated those two scores, and in this study got a correlation of 0.91. And I don't think I explained this before, but for those of you who don't know, a perfect correlation is 1. That's the highest you can get, is a score of 1, which you never get unless you correlate two things to each other. So 0.91 is an astoundingly high correlation, extremely rarely seen in educational research, but we see it not rarely in studies that compare ORF scores to comprehension. A more recent study done in 2010 with a large number of students, over 12,000, and this was a longitudinal study. They tested the students across the grades, and then at the end of third grade, using the different studies. They used DIBELS to measure their ORF score. They administered the Peabody Picture Vocabulary Test, which is another way of looking at comprehension. And then one of those 2-hour tests, the Stanford Diagnostic, and found that across the years that in first grade, we could tell what their third grade comprehension was going to be by looking at their growth in ORF of all the different measures, how they grew from fall to winter to spring best predicted their third grade comprehension. And in grades 2 and 3, their fall ORF scores best predicted their third grade end of year comprehension. So yeah. Comprehension is the most important thing, along with motivation, but we don't have hours and hours to assess each of our students. And we have decades of research that say ORF might be the very best way to not assess comprehension. We don't want to imply that it assesses comprehension, but it is an indicator of comprehension. Number 4, the final one I'm going to talk about here today is this one. And this is a very common one I see with school leaders and practitioners is that students with very low words correct per minute score need a fluency intervention. And I would say we have to be cautious here. They might need a fluency intervention, but we need to remember that the information we're getting from an ORF, the words correct per minute, is really quite analogous to the information we get from a thermometer. Both ORFs and thermometers have proven reliability and validity. We can trust the score. They give us consistent scores, and the scores are useful for us to make decisions. Both thermometers and words correct per minute can be determined very quickly, and both of them provide a score that is compared in some way to a benchmark. Now, you may not have thought about that in terms of a thermometer before, but that's true. You're looking for how close am I to average body temperature, and different from the benchmarks that we have for words correct per minute. They don't change from fall to winter to spring. They don't change from first grade to second grade to third grade. From birth to death, our human benchmark is somewhere around 98.6, but we have to have that benchmark in order to compare the number. But as wonderful, quick, reasonable, useful as thermometers are, or words correct per minute scores, neither of them are diagnostic. They're not meant to tell you, okay, they're meant to tell you something's wrong or not, something's not what it should be, but not why. So therefore, we can't, no physician would make a diagnostic decision based on a thermometer reading. They might say, oh, you have a fever of 102.8, so something's wrong. But that doesn't mean that they know what to do. This may be caused by the flu. It may be caused by, a physician told me that a ruptured appendix can cause a high elevated body temperature. There's a number of things. So we would not say, oh, you have a fever, let's rush you to the emergency and take out your appendix. It may be that you just need to maybe take some Tamiflu and a lot of liquid and rest for a few days. So it's not meant to be diagnostic. If we have a student stuck in here, their fluency is still developing. It's not that they have not yet achieved that fluent execution and coordination of the component pieces. We don't automatically know what what the problem is. It could be that fluency is the issue, that what they need to practice is the accuracy and the rate and become more automatic with their reading. But it's possible, if they're stuck in this area, that the real cause is something back at the origin stages. So we need to be prepared to do a little bit more assessment with the component pieces before we just jump in. And that shouldn't take a whole lot of extra time, but the ORF assessment should not lead directly to an intervention. So that's what I prepared today to talk about with you on the assessment piece. So once again, I'll pause and see if we have any questions.
So Jan, we have several questions. They're really good. We have about 4, and I know that you have some more content that you would like to get to as well, if that my understanding is correct.
Yes.
So maybe we could do 1 or 2.
Okay, let's try for 2.
Try for 2. Okay, so one of them, and because this is in the assessment section, one question from Patrick was, what are some good resources for how to measure prosody?
There are several, and most of them are actually free. And if you go just Google assessments of, often they're referred to as assessments of expression, but you could also Google prosody as well. The NAEP assessment has a 4-part scale for rating expression. So there aren't norms or guidelines really for grade level. It's a lot left to the teacher to make those decisions. But they'll give you some descriptors of hesitant, the phrasing is choppy, that kind of thing, up to fluid reading that mirrors speech. So the NAEP assessment has a scale. Tim Rosinski has a scale that's more, I think his is a 5-point scale with lots of good descriptors of what we should be aiming for. But at best, you're going to get something like a 5 or 6-point scale. So it doesn't have the sensitivity to notice big changes, but I think it is helpful for practitioners to familiarize yourself with some of those scales and share those with your students. So you can say, these are the things you're working toward, and model what that would look like and sound like for your students.
Thank you. And I apologize in advance for not being able to say all of our questions.
Yeah.
We can save them
Well, we
till the
may have
end
some
if we
time
do
toward
have
the
time.
end of this next
Yeah.
section is a little short, so we can save some possibly.
Yes, so here's another one because you said you wanted to. So this is from Sierra. So I've been told that when students reach higher grade levels, such as 7th and 8th grade, junior high level, that ORF assessments are no longer needed or helpful. What is your opinion of this?
Okay, well, I've got more than an opinion about that one. That's a very good question, Sierra. And it's probably something I should just put into my presentation. What we know from that 30-some years of research on the ORF measure is that as good as it is for finding those kids and serving as an indicator of proficient reading, once students reach about the 5th grade or 6th grade level of reading, the ORF automaticity just is much less of a contributor to overall reading skill. There's so much else going on at 5th and 6th grade. And please don't think about this. It's very important to not think about this as 5th graders or 6th graders. It's the 5th or 6th grade level of reading. So once a reader is reading at that level of proficiency, which is pretty darn good, you're reading multisyllable words, you're reading complex text. If you can read that pretty well, automaticity is just much less of a contributor to your comprehension, your overall reading ability. However, there are, if you work at middle school or high school or beyond, there are lots of kids in middle school, high school, and beyond who have not reached the level of 5th or 6th grade level proficiency in their reading. And ORF will still be a good indicator for them. And ORF does work for struggling readers who are older as a good tool for progress monitoring. But there are many other things we should be assessing once a student reaches the proficiency of 5th or 6th grade reading level. We want all of our students to get at least there, but a whole lot do not get there in 5th or 6th grade. So that's a great question. But remember to think about the level of reading, not their grade level placement when you're thinking about that. So that was it, Nicole? Okay.
Yeah, we had a couple of more, but I think we'll continue.
Yeah, I'll go on and then we'll see if I can have some time at the end. So teaching, it's really important. And Deb and I quote Roxanne Hudson and colleagues in our book who said so brilliantly that the growth of reading fluency in all its multifaceted glory is an outcome of many different kinds of instruction. And when I think of this, what pops in my head is Scarborough's rope. All of these things need to be in place, just like Marianne Wolf and her colleagues said. This passage reading fluency is the outcome of all these different component pieces. So we need to do all different kinds of instruction. And we need then to couple that with large amounts of carefully orchestrated reading practice. And in Scarborough's rope, that's what we can think about is happening at this stage. We've learned the component pieces. Now we need the practice to weave it all together for that beautiful orchestration as they talk about it. So we can help all of our students reach this level and beyond. This is just sort of a short representation, but fluency continues to develop across the years. It doesn't just end abruptly. We need to remember that. So this instruction and practice, when we talk about in our book Instruction, it was actually Deb that came up with this mnemonic that I just love. I think it's very clever and ties right into our theme today. When we're talking about fluency instruction, of course, we're really caring about comprehension and motivation. So she suggested that anytime you're teaching any aspect of fluency, you must be sure that you're addressing all three of these A's. And the first one, based on what I said earlier, shouldn't be a surprise to you. Accuracy, first, foremost, and forever, because it's the foundation of fluency. Accuracy at the letter level, the word level, the phrase level. Accuracy should be part of every fluency lesson. And then automaticity. We build on that accuracy to say the letters and the sounds and the words and the phrases and read text with automaticity that also has that expression and prosody so our students can access meaning. So AAA should be a little poster or something beside, maybe a big poster beside your teaching table or in your classroom. Talk to your students about that. Remind them that that's what's important for fluency. Accuracy, reasonable accuracy, remember, it doesn't have to be perfect, automaticity and accessing meaning. When we turn our attention to that practice, that carefully orchestrated practice, I've written about this in a couple of places about silent reading and the value or lack of value for silent reading. It's something that we are still studying, researchers are studying, but we do know that silent reading can have a place and can play a very important role in improving and strengthening reading, but only for those students with established foundational skills. For our struggling readers, reading silently and independently is not a good use of their time. If you're a fan, like I am, of Tim Shanahan and his work, I don't always agree with Tim 100% of the time, but often I do, and he's certainly well informed about a lot of reading research. He has a blog, pretty much weekly. He writes at Shanahan on Literacy is his blog. And he recently talked about silent reading and the role it should play in instruction. We do need to think always, I mean, this is an ORTIi conference. We're thinking about differentiating our work across the different tiers. When we think about providing reasonable instruction and practice for our students in a classroom setting, where we have our above level students, we have our on level students, we often have a lot of students sitting there too who are below level or struggling. And this is one of the things Tim wrote about recently too, was round robin reading. He talked about the fact that he was told that it was when he was studying to be a teacher that it was not a good thing to do. But then when he got in the classroom, especially around science and social studies and some chapter books, he felt he had to do it. And so he had the students taking turns reading parts of the text. And I'm not even going to take time to talk about the real disadvantages, especially for our struggling readers to be asked to read aloud. Or to even say pass when they don't want to read, and all the kids know why they're saying pass. So Anita Archer and her colleague in their book Explicit Instruction come up with a lot of wonderful alternatives to round robin that I've used extensively from early grades up through graduate school. I would have my college students do choral reading, close reading, augmented silent reading. Choral reading is everybody reads aloud together following the voice of the teacher. closed reading, everybody reads silently as the teacher reads aloud, but every once in a while you stop and the students say that word to show that they are following along. Augmented silent reading is you set the students up ahead of time before reading shorter pieces of text with specific questions in mind, and support their reading that way so that they are really paying attention. So it's monitored and they're held accountable for what they read. I also am a big fan of structured partner reading. I want to be sure that we're pairing the students correctly and considering the fact that there are some students in most classrooms who really should be protected from doing structured partner reading, and or just use their time more wisely. So this example is from a real classroom of fourth graders that I worked with once and just decided to write down their names. We set kids up for structured partner reading. So these are real kids. And what I asked the teacher to do is make a list of her students from her best reader to her most struggling readers, not based on Dibble's data or any kind of data at all, just on her opinion. So she put Ebony as her top reader, Michael as her middle reader, and she identified Juan, Kaisha, Francisco, and Angelica as her readers who were maybe so much lower than the other students that they should actually not do structured partner reading. So she took those students out of the mix, took her list from now 1 to 20 and divided them so that Ebony is partnered with Michael, Ebony being a very strong reader. Michael is a good, solid, average reader. Down at the bottom, Miguel, number 10, good, average reader, is paired with Ashley, who's not a strong reader, but not so weak that she can't benefit from working with Miguel, and not so weak that she would be embarrassed or humiliated to work with Miguel. So in every partnership, you've got one slightly stronger reader than the other. And of course, these are real human beings, so you have to look over the list to see if they can actually work together. And we don't keep them in these partners all year long, but this is a way to get started. So while the students are working together, the teacher can then have some time to work in more explicit direct instruction with those lower students. I'm not going to walk you through this, but a big fan also across the grades of the use of the 6-minute solution developed by another friend and colleague of mine, Gail Adams, where students are partnered and take turns reading for 1 minute with each other. It is available as a commercially available product, but the structure of the 6-minute solution, where the students just get their own materials, read out loud to each other for a minute at a time, can be really fun, engaging whole class practice. For our students who actually need intervention, I am a big fan of Read Naturally, and on a couple of levels. One is they do, again, they are a company that sells, I think, very excellent materials. They have a wide range of materials now. It used to be really specifically a fluency intervention, but they have quite a few things now. But they also have, and I do recommend those if it's appropriate for you and your school. But separate from that, their model of intervention, the Read Naturally strategy, is free. You can go online and look it up, and they can walk you through on any passages. You do not have to buy their materials. You do have to place students appropriately and set an appropriate words correct per minute goal, and then work on the accuracy first by following and reading along with the model. The students do a repeated reading from typically about 4 to 10 times to bring themselves up to a level of automaticity. And then they do a pass read with the teacher, where they have to do the accuracy, the automaticity, and the demonstrate good comprehension and expression as well. So I brought us pretty close to the end of the time. I want to go to my last slide and then see if we do have time for questions. Just reminding you that my goal, the key takeaway was this connection of fluency to comprehension. And I hope that I was able to affirm your knowledge or remind you of some things that you may have forgotten or expand your knowledge. And I do thank you very much. Our time is so limited today, but I'd love to continue a conversation. My Twitter handle @Jan Hasbrouck is devoted completely, my Twitter feed 100% on reading. So you're not going to get distracted by politicians or movie stars or anything else there. So that's a good place to reach me and connect with me for further possible conversations to have. So I'll stop sharing. And if Nicole, if you think we do have time for maybe 1 or 2 questions, I'm happy to do that.
Yeah, we are right at our time right now at ending at 12 o'clock. However, some of your content just now was touching on some of the questions that we had. So I think maybe in part some of that was answered. I also captured, I've captured the specific questions into a separate document, and I wonder if we can leave this room open if people want to, if you're open and have time to verbally do some more questions, I can be available to do that. As an alternative, we can post those questions in the materials for this from this session. And if you'd like to submit some answers written, and then we can have everyone access that later. So it's really, the ball is in your court with what you're able to do, Jan.
Well, I'm happy to do both if people do want to stick around. I know there's probably other sessions to go to, or maybe lunch, which is important too. I'm happy.
Session.
Yeah.
Yeah. But okay. Yeah, I can stay on and keep the room open if folks would like to stick around for a few more minutes.
Thank you all for being here.
One of the questions, oh, go ahead, Nicole.
Oh, I was just going to say, thanks all for being here. And we do have the link to the feedback for this session available here. It's also available in our digital program. We do look at all of that feedback, and our presenters look at that and appreciate it as a nice little reminder.
And if you want to share this with other colleagues, it'll be available on our website in the digital program within a few days.
Great. Okay, so are you ready for some questions?
Sure, yes.
Okay, and I put them a little bit out of order because some of them related to each
Yeah.
other. So one question from Jennifer was, can all students, so those with learning disabilities, get to the 50th percentile rate, or are there different expectations? If so, what variables or aspects must be taken into consideration to develop goals? And if I may, I'm going to add a piggybacked question.
Sure.
That relates to that. Should we be looking at words correct per minute more as a benchmark range for students by grade level instead of percentile ranks? Percentiles are dependent on the norm group and they fluctuate over time, especially if we start moving more and more students toward that 50th percentile. The 50th percentile words correct per minute number would eventually increase. So for example, first grade benchmark might be 60 to 91 words correct per minute, and that was submitted by Patrick. So if you scroll up, both of those questions are available for you if you need to review them.
That's a thoughtful observation from Patrick, because that often does happen when we are measuring skills, and then we get better and better at teaching those skills. And what we find over time is that the whole population, so we can think of the bell-shaped curve, starts to shift. And we do know that Louisa Moats and many other researchers are saying that 95% of children, if taught correctly can achieve grade level or close to grade level by the end of first grade. And if that's true, we're not going to have a bell-shaped curve anymore. We're going to have almost all kids squished up here in the proficient level of reading. And that's a wonderful day. And I'm looking forward to that. We actually, though, in terms of fluency, words correct per minute, it's not a skill in the same way that others are. And we have almost 30 years of evidence from the work that Jerry Tyndall and I did. If you go back and look at the norms from 1992 to 2017, a lot of years went by, they don't change that much. This is more like blood pressure and body temperature and cholesterol levels. Those haven't changed. Those don't change because they are kind of like bodily functions. And fluent reading is kind of like a bodily function. There's a point where you're just not going to get faster, and you don't want to get faster. You want to be that average. And it has to do with our thinking rates. It has to do with our memory retrieval rates. It has to do with how fast our mouths can work, all kinds of factors. So we do want to be sure that we're treating all of those numbers, even on those Hasbrouck and Tyndall norms of 6 million kids, that any of those numbers as an individual number have a range of a confidence interval around them. It's not that 92 is great and 90 is not good enough. They're all ranges. So there's that to consider. So I thought about Patrick's question first. And then can you remind me, Nicole, quickly what the first part of the question was?
First part, yeah. So, and you may have touched on this already. So can all students, so those with learning disabilities, get to that 50th percentile rate? And I think that's a really important question.
It is a very important question, and one near and dear to my heart, because along with reading fluency, I have spent a lot of time in recent years thinking and actually writing a book about dyslexia. And a question that I get from my colleagues who specialize in dyslexia and research colleagues and ever, it always comes up about fluency. As early as we intervene with these students, and we can and do see evidence of bringing students with dyslexia, getting their accuracy up to a very high level, even with complex text and multisyllabic words. One of the most intractable aspects of reading for students with dyslexia is what we would call fluency, all aspects of fluency, that accuracy with rate, that automaticity with the prosody in it, it's like the holy grail. It's the hardest thing to make a change in a student with dyslexia, especially if dyslexia is moderate to severe. And especially if there has been a delay in appropriate services for this student. So if the student is identified at 3rd or 4th grade, which most students now are, if they're lucky, they're identified at 3rd or 4th grade, and then we start appropriate interventions, we don't have a whole lot of evidence that we have figured out how to help those students become fluent readers. We know a lot about how to get them to be accurate readers, and how to build their comprehension, or going around fluency with good vocabulary and lots of work on semantics and syntax and morphology and all these things. But yeah, fluency is really, really hard for some of our students, and it may, and I get questions all the time that really resonate with me, just like, I'm working with a student who's just slow at everything. Maybe not a child with a learning disability or dyslexia, but they're just slow. And I think that takes me right back to my early years of teaching, where for several years I worked with this little kid named Danny. I actually still remember his last name, but Danny was slow. He just was slow on everything that he did. So I do know that those kids exist too. There may be physical or cognitive issues that have to do with speed, aspects of reading. But certainly when we're in the realm of children with unidentifiable learning disability that may include dyslexia, it's just it's just challenging. So part of that question, I think, was making sure that our goals for the students are reasonable. And yes, we should reference norms so that we know what we're aiming for, the 50th to 75th percentile. We want to be sure we're aiming, we know what our ultimate goal is. But for a student who's significantly below the 50th percentile, we make goals around where they are. And where we think they can reasonably achieve, and be willing to adjust those goals. If we're all doing our very best work, we're working as hard as we can, we're not achieving those goals, let's be willing to make some adjustment in those goals.
Yeah, I like the idea of having those parallel goals. So we have
Yeah.
kind of our long term, and then here's where our next step is. I think that's a great solution to that
I think it's
situation.
important for kids and parents too. I remember being chastised correctly by a parent early on in my teaching when I was going on and on about her child that I was seeing and raving about how well she's doing and all this. And the parent just looked at me and said, if she's doing so well, why is she getting special reading from you? And I thought, oh, yeah. I mean, in my work with her, she started here and she's here, and that's wonderful. But yeah, her grade level's here. So with kids and parents and ourselves, we need to keep both pieces in mind. Where are you in progress you're making, that hard work you're doing, but where's our ultimate goal? Yeah.
Okay, so there were two other submitted questions, and they're kind of similar. So one asks, they're asking about specific interventions or strategies for kind of two different profiles of students.
Okay.
So one is, so we are told that everyone needs an intervention if their ORF score is low. What about students who are reading accurately, but the rate is low? And again, you kind of touched a little bit on this. So obviously they would need some different intervention than those who are not fluent due to decoding issues. So what types of interventions would be appropriate?
That's the point.
Yeah, exactly.
That is exactly the point. They both have, ultimately, both of those kids would have comprehension problems. And the biggest mistake we make is that we give, comprehension interventions for kids that the cause of that comprehension problem is way back down the line. Mm-hmm. So if the problem is way back down the line at the decoding level, then we work at the word identification level, the sounding out the words, more complex words, reading phrases accurately first, and then with the rate and expression built into that, scaffolding that at the word and phrase level. So I think that sounds like that was understood. If they can read accurately, those kids who can read, maybe they read a year or so below grade level, or maybe they actually even can read grade level text, but they don't do it fluently. The best intervention I've seen from that, and I was just reading a study about this yesterday, the best ideas we have is to make sure we're maintaining their accuracy. So not pushing them to read faster and faster and faster and sacrificing accuracy ever, but working on maintaining accuracy with increasing rate, increasing appropriate rate, never just as fast, never just as fast as you can, but increasing appropriate rate with expression that also leads to comprehension. So that's why I went over very, very quickly, but that's the essence of the Read Naturally strategy. So again, I want to separate the wonderful Read Naturally products, which I do recommend if you can afford them and want to go look at them. But the strategy is giving students a piece of very difficult text, working with them so that they can learn to read it accurately. So the level of difficulty has to be achievable. I mean, they have to achievable, but we start with challenging text with some unfamiliar words. They start with building their accuracy by reading along with a tape or a recorded version of the reading, or with a live tutor. They read simultaneously until they know all the words. So accuracy first. Then they do repeated reading, and there is just decades of evidence that repeated reading can be helpful. So they take that piece of text and read it generally for a minute each time. They just keep reading it and reading it and reading it and see if they can get closer and closer to a goal that you have set for them. And then when they can read accurately at an appropriate rate, then they read aloud to the teacher or somebody who can do an evaluation, and read with reasonable accuracy, only allowing in the read naturally strategy, they say no more than 3 errors. If you make a 4th error, that's too many errors. And I like that because it allows some errors because we're human beings. So read with reasonable accuracy at an appropriate rate, which would be specifically set for that child. Read it with good expression and able to answer some questions. So that's the intervention that I would use. Some version of that. I like the read naturally strategy, but build the accuracy, practice to keep the accuracy and build the rate, move to automaticity, read it at a preset level, and be able to answer some questions. That works really well, and motivating for kids because they know where their goal is and they like to read it. And if you can choose some interesting passages for them to read, that's a wonderful, powerful, effective intervention.
Yeah. Perfect. Thank you for sharing that. And so that last question, again, is kind of another kind of student skill situation. So what about so students who are accurate, so they are accurate and they can read at a reasonable rate, but cannot answer comprehension questions correctly. So, so some recommendations are wanted for these students. And then also, is their issue more in the language strands? Is that kind of,
well, that would be my first question. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
That's a diagnostic question. That's why it's always hard to do any of these attempts to answer questions about specific children when I'm not there to look at the child. I do have colleagues who refuse to even try to answer these kind of questions for that reason, because I don't know what I'm talking about if I don't have that data, that diagnostic data on who that child is. So that would be my first question. I want to praise the child and the teacher. If they can read accurately and they can read at a reasonable rate, yay, you've done so much of the work. So but they're not understanding what they've read. What's the reason for that? So I would go to Scarborough's rope and find some assessments to check out those component pieces. Is English their first language? Are they having some issues around processing language or speech or language? Those are really harder things to assess. You might, if it's really a severe issue, you might want to find your local speech language pathologist and ask them for some help around figuring out the puzzle of language. It can be for some students. I've worked with students for whom it's an attention issue, which can be tied a little bit to motivation, but it's just like they didn't learn to pay attention, that metacognition of reading. While I'm reading along, I'm supposed to be paying attention to what these words mean. Some kids never learned that. So addressing that as well. And what I do for that is usually go down to the, I go back down as far as I need to go, but often it's to the sentence level. Read this sentence to me, stop. And now we're going to talk about this sentence. The prince ran out of the castle. Okay. Who was in this sentence? I don't know. Okay, let's read it again. And we'll read it until, or I'll read it to them. Is it a vocabulary? So they don't know what a prince is. They don't know what a castle is. But when we take it down to the sentence level, which if you've got, 30 some kids or something, this can be hard to do. This really is an intervention, and doing intervention around comprehension is very time consuming. But you do want to get all those questions out of the way first. Can they even understand the text? And reading it to them and asking them some questions is a good way to get past that or get that out of the way. But sentence level or phrase level, if necessary, or paragraph level. Don't ask these children who have those challenges to read a page or a chapter and then deal with their comprehension. We have to scale back